Hello, everyone. This week, I've asked Dr. Magdalena Zolkos on to talk with us about Frankenstein. Dr. Zolkos is currently a Humboldt Research Fellow at Goethe University in Frankfurt in Germany. She's written a lot about politics, about psychoanalysis, literature, writing across an extraordinary range of topics. And she has been very kind in putting aside some time to talk to us today about Frankenstein. It's something that she has thought about, and she has a book coming out soon, which I will advertise and do a link to. But she, in the book, has written about Frankenstein. Now, this is, so Magdalena, thank you very much for coming and speaking to my students. I appreciate it. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. I'm just wondering why you think it is that this book, you know, the first version comes out in 1818, the next, you know, it's revised 1831. Why so many books get written and forgotten about? Why does this book hold such fascination for us? So many film adaptations, so many engagements with it. What do you think that's about?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley and some of those ideas in the book. I mean, yeah, it's a great starting question, right? Because indeed, like so many works of that period are either forgotten or historicized in a certain way, that like we do recognize they are important, but we also know that they represent certain concerns that perhaps are no longer with us, right? So I read your question as a way of asking, like, why is Frankenstein still with us in ways that animates us, that you know, sparks our imagination, fascination, perhaps horror for some of us as well when we read those passages. And I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's because there's something very smart about that book, which is that it thematizes as literary motifs certain concerns. So I'll mention them in a moment, that are still present, but are very much linked to the period of the Western European Enlightenment. But it does it, so when Mary Shelley does it in a way, and that's what I mean when I say it's a smart book, it does in a way that puts a question mark over those concerns, right? So the main such motif, of course, is the idea of a scientist. Science is something that transgresses boundaries of what is socially accepted, but also what is technologically possible, right? So that's, I think, a very pertinent question for our times, given, you know, what technology can do, what biotechnology can do. But then, because so much goes wrong in the book, right? I think it's not really affirmative, right? It doesn't affirm science as a domain of human capacity. In other words, she doesn't give scientists green light, like go for it, you know? So that, I think that is the question. And another one of such sort of motifs that she articulates or includes in the book that sometimes gets brushed aside, but I think it's also important, is the question of education, because, you know, that's just the beginning of the book, that the creature gets created. But then what is very striking is that it's almost like the creature is born. There is a lot about how in the 18th and 19th century people thought about early childhood that is happening, how he kind of awakens to the world. But then he also goes through a period of education, and it doesn't just refine him, right? It doesn't just give him skills or tools. In other words, his education is not a STEM education. His education is more like your student's education. He's transformed by a humanistic knowledge.
Yeah, right.
But it's also not quite affirmative. Like, that's beautiful, right? Like and that sometimes get missed out, because philosophy at the time would say it's a transformative process. It's almost like a liberating process. If you want to be free, you need to be educated. But the results of his education are quite tragic just as
Yes,
much as
that's
his
interesting.
creation.
That is very interesting, actually, and that scientific motif. And you say the Enlightenment. I mean, one way of thinking about that, I guess, is to think it's a romantic reaction to Enlightenment ideas, and you can see that as a kind of standard motif about the coldness and the detachment of science, but also the presence of nature. Both of them are kind of, one way of reading it is the monster is like Emma Bovary, reads Goethe and off he goes for his walks. But what do you think of that idea? It's a kind of romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. It's too neat in a way, but what do you think of that idea?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really good starting point to that novel, to recognize its connection to romantic literary and romantic philosophic tradition. And of course, the question of nature, the importance of nature in that book, and certain animism of nature. And I'm using this word cautiously because I think it often gets misinterpreted. I don't mean like an agency of nature, but the relation between human soul and nature. I mean, in some ways, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of like revealing something that I find difficult about teaching that text, which is that, I'm sorry if that's a bit profane, but it can be a really boring book to teach.
Of course. Yes.
Because the thing that fascinates us, that gets so inscribed into our cultural reading of that book, they're like, there's one passage and I'm like, oh, I want to know more. Like, where is that? Like, there's no, it was supposed to be about this galvanism and electricity, and it's just like a passing. And then you have like 20 pages about Geneva Lake, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And look, this raises another question, right? You get this, you get this moment of mentioning a certain theoretical concern or galvanism, as you say, as this kind of focus. And then you go off in these descriptive passages or this internal wrangling that goes on within Dr. Frankenstein. So I guess the question is why do we bother? Like, why literature? Because if you're going to look at some issue, why not read history? Why not read philosophy? Why not read the science? Why not read the sociology? What is it about why would we bother turning to a novel? And this is something we've got to think about with the students, right? Because we're looking at Frankenstein as this novel, and then we're going and looking at essays on in vitro meat and the gig economy and other aspects of science and technology. Why, for instance, in your book, what's the point of literature in this context?
Yeah, I know, another great question. I mean, I think, it is connected to, I think, the brilliance of Shelley's book, but also kind of to this larger question. I'm not saying every literature can do that, but she's definitely doing it. Namely, the book for me has a number of questions at its heart that generations of interpreters, of readers, now for 200 years, right? Over 200 years, have not been able to answer definitively. And I think literature, philosophy perhaps too, but I think literature especially is really good at doing exactly this, asking good questions that you will then do all this work to answer, and you still haven't done it in a way that puts Frankenstein to bed, if you like. So, maybe to be more specific, the question that has bothered readers, right, and that almost every generation of readers, of interpreters answers differently, is what exactly goes wrong in the story? Because that is kind of incredible, but it's not really obvious. Like, so in other words, what is Victor's crime, and also, I think another related question, what goes wrong for the creature? So why is he so radically unacceptable by the human community? What is at the heart of his reaction, right? And so, so they of course are related, but the first kind of, and that's it's a more complicated kind of answer, but just to give you a very brief sketch of, if you like, the history of reading Frankenstein, is that the kind of the first impulse to interpret this book like a Promethean interpretation. And you have Prometheus in the chapter, right? So of course, Shelley has been suggestive here, but I think in some ways ironically suggestive, that what goes wrong is that Victor undertakes a task that has been domain of the gods, right? So kind of similarly to Prometheus, who steals fire for humanity, he brings life, right? He brings life into being from dead matter. So that has been kind of like, you can almost call it like a Christian interpretation, if you like. Yeah. It's a critique of human hubris, but exactly insofar as the human has undertaken a divine act or divine authority, right? Divine capacity. So then comes, if you like, a second wave of interpretations that I would call liberal interpretation, that is much more pragmatic and that says something very different. So it's not preoccupied with God at all.
Hang on, can I stop you there for a second? So by liberal, you mean a political doctrine, to explain?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They're associated with philosophers like Locke and so on about the rights of the individual and this sort of, is this what you mean?
Yeah. But as a literary interpretation of the text, it doesn't come prior to the 20th century. So it's influenced by liberal ideas. And what I mean by this is that it connects science and society, right? So what that interpretation would suggest that the problem or at the heart of Victor's crime, so to say, is that he disconnects scientific pursuit, scientific ambition from the question of the social role or social utility, if you like, of his invention. And that is an interpretation, I think, that, it's also connected to Prometheus, because Prometheus was exactly the opposite, right? Like his invention was driven by his love for humanity. But if you read that novel really carefully around Victor's education and what goes wrong, what kind of, especially, so students beware, this happens when he goes to university. Because until he goes to university, like basically leaves home for university, he's very much trained in this, like, in those ideas that are very much grounded in the Enlightenment, in so-called social moral sentiment tradition, which is that we are all meant to work for the larger good. So it's also connected to
his family too. Like his family exemplifies this attitude.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, he is raised by humanitarians, right? Like, so a modern Frankenstein would be like a son of like two activists that go to Africa to do good. Or that work like in a soup kitchen or something. Yes, exactly. They are modern humanitarians, and he's raised like this. And he says that what happens when he goes to university, he forgets that, right? He gets so caught up in reading books, and that's also another warning. He doesn't just read STEM, right? So at that time, even though it's a scientific education he gets, he reads a lot of philosophy, he reads a lot of mythology, he reads a lot of works by alchemists, right? Which, it's a bit earlier period, but it's kind of, books that were prohibited by, of course, decades earlier or even centuries earlier, but that have certain kind of criminal intent. So they inspire his imagination. Yeah. So that's like another wave. And then I'll just mention this because I don't want to go too long, but there's another wave that I find really interesting, which is when feminism, psychoanalysis, and something called monster studies, so much more recent, kind of discover that text, right? I mean this figuratively. And they say that something completely different is at the heart of the problem, which has also been really strong strongly kind of thematized by Shelley in her book, which is that Victor fails not as a scientist, not as a citizen, but he fails as a father.
Mm.
He abandons his creature, right? He turns his back, he runs away. And there's some really interesting links between that and the way that Mary Shelley thought of herself as an intellectual and a mother. And the way she criticized certain figures of her contemporaries, exactly for that failed love. So if you like, Victor fails at loving, right?
And he has quite weird, when you read what he thinks he's going to get as a father, I think at one point in the book he says something like, and this child of mine will be eternally grateful to me for bringing me into existence. It's like, and you know, when it's framed with that quotation from Paradise Lost at the start, where Adam's basically going, I didn't ask to be brought into existence, you know, there's that tension that's set up. But I just want to, because you know, I've been reading your book, and it's you developed some really interesting ideas, and it's about restitution, which is normally what we'd think of as righting a wrong, a kind of compensation. Is it related to a kind of idea of debt, like injustice is a debt that is then paid, repaired, or something? And for you, the novel hooks into that question in a particular way. So how do you see that as part of what you're writing about with restitution and justice?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a big question. Or have I put the question badly? Or?
No. It's exactly it. I'm just trying to find a good entry point.
Yeah.
You know, I think perhaps the best way of kind of entering this is to say that, like, what I've interested me in Frankenstein, I mean, all these things, but that we've spoken about so far, but as another tool of critique, if you like, or perhaps to put it a bit more figuratively, as a kind of a mirror that we can look at ourselves through. And that's its critique of the idea of humanity, that I think also, I mean, it starts in the Enlightenment, but also is so incredibly powerful that we don't even notice it, how powerful it is, you know, how defining it is of our culture. And what I mean by this is the idea that we might be critical of tribalism, of people's, you know, loyalties and sense of identity built around particular identities, like the nation, you know, like I think we are quite capable of being critical about that, or other forms of tribalism, you know, however we defined we belong. But I think what has been quite a common currency is the idea that what would almost rescue us as humanity is if we accepted that it's quite we are all humans, and it's quite obvious who is the human. It's enough to look, right? And you see, regardless of gender, race, color, ethnicity, belonging, we are all humans. And that on that basis, we are capable of building an inclusive ethics, right? Some kind of ethics of peace, ethics of acceptance, ethics of assisting others who are suffering. And when you think about it, it's incredibly powerful in, you know, starting from the way we engaged in global politics, in some kinds of interventions, you know, be it military interventions to more kind of soft power interventions, missionary work, all sorts.
International Declaration of Human Rights articulates
human rights, absolutely, yes, the first thing to mention, but also science, you know, like how do we think of that idea of social utility? And it's often defined that the role of science is to decrease or perhaps eliminate human suffering in all sorts of forms, right? It's been a really strong concern, a legitimizing point. Yeah. And so, sorry, that's a bit of a roundabout way.
No, that's great. It's really interesting and does relate to a lot of what we will be going on to talk about. So that's perfectly relevant, actually.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, because I think if we have this in mind and then open the book, we see that the figure of the creature helps us see some problems in that thinking, which is that any kind of inclusive approach to the human is also based on some exclusions, right? Which is to say, what does the creature want? Freudian question, right? What does the creature want? Like, he wants two things. One, he does want some kind of romantic relation, right? Like, he pursues Victor, asking him, create a female, right? Like, he wants some kind of heterosexual relationship with someone from his own species. But what he wants even more than that, and he's quite explicit about this, is he wants to be accepted by humanity. That's why he approaches, there's a whole other, I mean, yeah, so I'm guessing students have read that book. Yeah. There's a whole other kind of motif of Delaney's, which are refugees from France. Yeah. And he kind of hides, right, as in part of their kind of farm or whatever, their cottage, not farm, cottage. And he wants to be accepted by them, right? Like, he thinks they epitomize humanity, not by their ideals. And he's rejected, right?
At least by the seeing ones, right? Like, so.
By the seeing ones, that is it. That is a key to it, right? Like, a key to why he's rejected, what's so repulsive about him, why he is defined as someone that is not simply excluded from humanities, he's intolerable, right? And so, like, what I'm doing in my chapter in the book is kind of both suggest that as humanity, we actually need someone like that. Someone that might look, I mean, he's not, he looks quite human, right? Yes. He's composed of human parts, but he's unacceptable. And so what I'm suggesting in the book is that those ideologies of inclusive humanity as a source of our ethics, as a way in which we can effectively respond to the problem of suffering, at their heart, they actually need to exclude. They need monsters. They need someone who's subhuman or infrahuman, if you like, who flies under the radar, who's not detected as the human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a kind of limit case or something, as a boundary case or something that falls outside that. Or so almost in setting up that criterion, you need things outside of it. And in this case, the monster is precisely that creature.
Yeah. Someone who lies beyond redemption as well. I mean, that's why it connects to the idea of restitution, right?
Right.
There is no redemption for him. Like, the only thing he can do for humanity is, well, I mean, he can die. Victor wants to kill him, right? He wants to eliminate him. And he kind of dies at the end, but before he dies biological death, he's also kind of thrown outside of the boundaries of the human geographically, right? So from the Alps, the Swiss Alps, it kind of resides for a moment in the Arctic period, which at the time was connected to like sublime landscape, right? Like, to the idea that this is a land the closest to the horizon, almost the ends of the earth. So he resides geographically outside the boundaries of humanity, right? Yeah. In an unpopulated land. Yeah. Yeah, but if I can just add one final thing, which another kind of which relates to exactly that question of like, why? Like, if someone told me that, I would want to like, why this even happens? Like, why is he rejected, right? Like, why is he denied inclusion in humanity? Why he's denied Victor's love as a father, right? Or as Victor's child, so Victor is a father. And of course, that's another question that like generations of scholars and literary scholars and readers of the book have produce their own answers to. But there's been really interesting work that kind of connects the ethical dimension, of which I've kind of spoken a lot about, with the aesthetic dimension. And that, I think, is interesting because we tend to, and that's another kind of legacy we get from the Enlightenment, we tend to think that we can separate those two.
Yeah.
In other words, we won't judge people by the way they look.
Of course.
we will be like, okay, this is your moral universe, and this is aesthetic. These are aesthetic choices. You can, whatever you like, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't connect to your, if you like, normative framework by which you live. But if the creature can teach us something, is that perhaps we connect those two much more than we think.
Yes.
Because perhaps why he's rejected is because he's so ugly.
Yeah. Yeah, right. This is yeah. And there's the moral relevance of disgust, right? What Martha Nussbaum writes about is it's hard to negotiate, but it's something we have to negotiate. But
he's so ugly that but also, why is he so ugly? Like there is a little kind of passage that we tend to maybe not notice, but like it's the description in the kind of still the first part of the book when Victor describes what he calls his ungodly, his ungodly pursuits, his ungodly occupation.
Yeah.
You can imagine he sneaks into cemeteries, like, of course, in the, at night, because it's criminal act. And he says he's like, choosing bits and pieces of corpses, and that he's guided by ideas, like almost functional ideas. So he's choosing the best. Yeah. I mean, it's really terrifying.
Yeah.
But he's also driven by aesthetic concerns. Yes. He's choosing them by beauty. So you can imagine, he's like, oh, this is a beautiful nose, right? Yeah. These are beautiful eyes. This is these are beautiful hands. So, and that's, so I suggest he's like a proto-Nazi almost.
Yeah, yes.
By the way, he wants to create some kind of, he wants to create someone who is human, but also in some ways, like an Übermensch.
That's very interesting. Yeah, right. I hadn't thought of it in those terms.
Yeah. There's not a single, like all the humans that, like, there's not a single human being that would be perfectly beautiful, but his creature will be, because he consists of all those parts that are, yeah. And so the question then, like, and then when you read the passage, the next chapter, when the creature wakes up, the effect is the opposite. He is unbearably ugly, right? He opens his eye, like, I mean, it's not, the description is, it's really one passage. So he opens his eye and he has this yellow eye, and that's the first thing that, that puts Victor off, if you like, that repulses him. There is a scholar at Stanford, Denise Gigante, who has written a great text about it called Facing the Ugly. Uh-huh. And she reads Frankenstein together with philosophic ideas around beauty, which is really interesting because we tend to read Frankenstein together with ideas around the sublime, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and so the same philosopher, Edmund Burke, has also written about beauty, which maybe we don't really think of him that way. But so she reads Frankenstein together with Edmund Burke's essay about beauty.
Yeah.
And he said what Burke affirms as beautiful, the creature contradicts. And
because Burke does both of those in that book. He does, but we only read the sublime bits.
Exactly, yeah. But he has a passage about skin. He has a passage about the eye. Like he says, the beautiful eye is like the clear eye, right? That you can look into the eye. Like, I mean, not Frankenstein, Burke, Edmund Burke, right? In the essay on the beautiful. He says, the beautiful human eye is the one that you look into the eye and it's almost transparent. It's clear. So you can see the soul of a person when you look into their eyes.
Yeah.
And then you read Frankenstein, whose eye is yellow.
Wow.
So it's exactly the opposite. He doesn't have a soul, right? And the eye indicates it.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you so much for this. We've taken up enough of your time. Really appreciate the conversation. Hopefully students learned a lot. I've learned a lot. So thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to have a chat to us.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for listening.